Hey guys, Will here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to wash your car using a simple 2-sponge and bucket and hose approach. No pressure washers, nothing like that, nothing expensive. So I'm going to be showing you how to wash your car without scratching the crap out of it. Now I know that might seem a easy fundamental type of thing, but the number of cars I see on the road that have swirl marks all over them, and it's just not necessary. If there's a couple of little things that you can do in your technique that will keep your car looking brand new for years and years. So let's jump into it. Okay, so before we start, there's a couple of fundamentals that we need to cover straight off the bat. The first is the types of sponges that we use and how many. So you can see here I've got 2 sponges. One is going to be the sponge that I use to wash the body of the car. The second sponge I'm going to use to wash anything that's really dirty with grit or anything like that, and the wheels. And what I do is I wash my sponges every single time I've washed the car in the washing machine to make sure that they're nice and clean. You can see on these there's absolutely nothing, they're like brand new. So really important straight from the onset to make sure that the equipment that you're using is clean. I use a 2-bucket wash system as well. So my first bucket is my soap, and you can see here I'm using CT18 Super Wash, which is a soap only kind of system that doesn't have any wax in it or anything like that. Now the reason I don't use wax is because my car's got ceramic paint protection on it, so I don't need to, but you can use whatever soap system you want. Everybody's got their own preferred product, and I don't really want to get into that in this video. This is the one that I use. So I've got my wash bucket, which has got my warm soapy water in it. Then I've got my rinse bucket, which I'll be using to clean the sponge after each pass. So you dip your sponge into the bucket, get it nice and wet and soapy, and then once you finish washing a part of the car, put it into your rinse bucket and wash off any of the dirt that's on there. Now, you can buy grit guards for buckets, which is like a mesh that sits in the bottom of the bucket. And what that does is it stops you from picking up any of the grit and dirt when you dip your sponge back in. I don't bother with those personally because I just make sure I keep my sponge in the top of the bucket so I'm not stirring and picking up all that rubbish. So the first step is to get the car as clean as possible just using a hose. Now you can see here, I've got really good water pressure at home, so I don't need to bother with a high pressure washer. At my old house, I had really bad water pressure, so I always used a blaster to get as much dirt off as possible. But in this case, I'm just gonna wash the car with the hose, get as much dirt off as I can before I actually start using a bucket and sponge. So we'll start off with that, and then I'll show you my sponge technique. Now one thing I should have mentioned is it's always a good idea to try and wash the car in the shade if you can. Unfortunately, I don't have a shady carport or anything like that, and I can't control the weather, so I have to do it in the sun today. But what you can see is happening is the water is evaporating off the car with the hot surface quite quickly. And also what will happen is when you sponge the car, if you don't work quickly, the soap will start to bake onto the paint in the sun as well. So if you are washing your car in the sun, try to do it as quickly as you possibly can. Otherwise, try to do it in a shady area. So now we'll get on to sponging the car down. So when we're washing the car with the sponge, the most important thing is to start from the top of the car. That way all your suds will run down and wash dirt off as they go. The last thing we want to do is start at the bottom where the car's dirtier and scrub. Now I don't do any scrubbing at all, I don't do any swirling. All I do is I get my sponge nice and wet and I just glide it across the surface. Now I don't put any pressure on the body of the car at all. I'm letting the sponge do all of the work. All I'm doing is just gliding it across. Now, if you do have some stubborn dirt, sometimes you need to give it a bit of a scrub. So generally, the more often you wash the car, the easier it is and the less chance you have of scratching your car. So I try to stick to straight lines, one area first, and then I'll rinse the sponge off. As soon as it starts to get dirty, I'll rinse the sponge off and start the process again. So let's go. So I've got heaps of soap on the sponge, so it all just sort of runs straight off. And I'm just gliding the sponge across, pushing the water down as I go. I'm not putting any pressure on the body of the car at all. See here, I'm only doing the top half, and then I'll come along and finish the bottom right at the very end, because the bottom tends to be the dirtiest part of the car. The reason the bottom's the dirtiest is because the tyres flick up dirt, but also when it rains, the dirt tends to sort of get pushed to the bottom of the car. So this area down here tends to be the dirtiest, so you want to do that last. so we've gone around and cleaned the whole top side of the car now, so we need to go around the skirts and clean the bottom. So get your sponge clean again. Get it nice and soapy. And again, just gliding across, not scrubbing. And don't get the sponge up underneath the car because there'll be a whole lot more dirt there. That's the absolute last thing that you want to do. Alright, so we've finished cleaning the body of the car. Now don't be tempted to just throw your sponge back in the bucket because obviously that's going to pick up any dirt that's in the bottom. So just lay it over the edge like that once you're done. Now we want to rinse off the soap before it starts to bake into the car, then we can move on to the wheels. Alright, so I've got my wheel sponge here, which has been out of the washing machine and is perfectly clean, like brand new. Now, I always start with the rear wheels first, simply because they tend to be the cleanest, not as much brake dust and so forth. So the trick here, get them as soapy and wet as possible. Use as much water as you possibly can. The more water you're using, the more lubricant you'll have and the less likely you are to scratch with the brake dust, because brake dust is really abrasive and it will scratch stuff up if you just scrub. So get it nice and wet. And again, we're just kind of going around the wheel. We're not scrubbing, we're just kind of dabbing. And you can see already the sponge is starting to dry out. So dip it in my rinse bucket, back in my suds, and keep going. So you'll use a lot of water here if you do it properly. It can be quite difficult to get all the dirt out of the corners. It just takes a bit of time, but you'll get there. But yeah, the trick here is to always replenish. So if the sponge is starting to get dry, just put more water on it. Don't work with a dry sponge because you'll end up scratching things. Alright, so because I clean this car once a week or so, all inside the sills and all that kind of thing is all pretty clean already, but this would be a good point to grab another sponge and clean inside your door sills and that kind of thing if you need to. But the next step is to dry the car. Now I use a big, nice microfiber towel, as you can see, nice and big. Just fold it up into four. And like we did with the sponge, we just work from the top down and just dry it off gently. No scrubbing, no swirling. Just run it over the car. Now, you may find that you need to use a second towel if it gets really saturated, but we're just running it over the body of the car. And you can see there it's picking up all of the water, not leaving any marks, not leaving any swirls. Now, if you do spot any dirty patches while you're doing this, go back and clean them properly. Don't try to just rub it off with the towel because you will pick up the dirt. Because this isn't wet, because it's dry, you've got a lot more chance of scratching your car with the towel than you do with the sponge, which is wet and lubricated. So if you do find any dirty patches that you've missed with the sponge, go back and clean them properly. Don't think you can just skim over them with the towel. So I'm going to finish off drying the rest of the car now. Hopefully you found this video interesting and useful. I'm sure I've skimmed over a couple of little bits and pieces, so if I've missed anything, let me know in the comments below. But yeah, look, hopefully this is the method that I've always used to wash my cars. I've never had a swirl mark on a single car, and I've never had a single problem. So hopefully you found it interesting and useful. If you have, please make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next thing, and I will see you next time. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.